I think it's a pretty common realization now that uh, Western culture is modeled after Roman culture. But if we look closely at Roman culture, you know, the structuring of Roman culture, it didn't just come out of thin air. It was modeled after Egyptian culture, after Egypt. Egypt, uh, out of all the other civilizations, Egyptian culture, they were renowned for slaves. Unwilling slaves specifically was what Egyptian culture had and harbored. And they harbored them to the point where it was a vast nation of slaves. All of Israel was enslaved by Egypt. And Egypt, like Egypt's native people, they were very few in number. And in looking back at how things were initially made, we can kind of get a true perception of what's to come. Because ultimately, in the end, Egyptian culture, they tried to kill their slaves who were escaping. And they in Egyptian culture let the slaves go, but then they decided to try to kill them anyway. And that's the level of hate, the level of insanity. But that's not really what I want to focus on. What I want to focus on is specifically the Egyptian culture and how Roman culture and Western culture all stem from Egypt, and it's the root of a very, very systemic problem. And the problem is the culture of transhumanism. It's a culture of transgenders. It's a culture of crossbreeding. And it's a culture of divination, debauchery, and just pure wickedness. And in terms of, debauchery, if you think about it, you're encouraged to, egg on women to have multiple sex partners and then take these women as your wife, knowing full well that she quite literally has had her back blown out by, an entire football team. And that stems from Egyptian culture. Egyptian culture would not allow for a young virginal woman to go unplugged. It was considered to be a great honor for her chastity to be taken and done away with so she can fully ascend into womanhood. It was common practice in Egyptian culture for a woman to truly not know who her baby's father really was. And that was okay. I mean, you just look at the story of Moses. I mean, they didn't even know where Moses came from, and they just accepted a random baby because they didn't care where the child came from. None of that mattered. All that mattered was, did you get your nut off in this particular society? And in Egyptian society, divination was a big thing. Divination meaning magic usage, predicting the future, and speaking with mediums. And what do we see today? We see all these Marvel superheroes and all these phantasmic powers in today's culture, but all that stemmed from the transhumanism of Egyptian culture. They had Ra and Set and Anubis and all these weird deities and Baal. They had all these strange powers. These powers of divination, these powers of maintaining youth, of applying makeup, of freedoms that are not really freedoms at all. It's their limiters, but they're portrayed as freedoms. They pushed the ability to mistreat others as a superpower. As a gift that you're giving to humanity. The power of divination is like when they would pretend that what they're doing, by knowing the outcome of certain events, well, that's their ability. Their ability to predict the future, like how some people bet on video games, I mean not video games, but games, and they predict what team is going to win. This was a huge deal back in Egyptian culture, consorting with witches and warlocks and mages, and them using alchemy to influence the minds of others. They would use chemical compounds to help subdue this vast society of slaves that they created. They would have everybody drugged up and malnourished on tainted bread and make them work and bake out in the sun all day long to further not only humiliate them, but to dull their senses. They would have dogs in these societies that they would elevate above people. They would feed these animals very well. And they would have people working tirelessly to groom and feed and provide everything for these dogs. And these dogs were crossbred to perfection. And the dogs were worshipped as deities because they believed that in the hearts and minds of beasts lived the true heart of God in their society. And what they would do is they would lower people. Like today in our society right now, where, they're transgenders, but they essentially are the entertainers and the fools of society. You turn on your radio and you're hearing more than likely one of them sing. They're singing in a very specialized tone that only one of them could possibly hit, because this is the culture adapted from Egypt. And not only that, but the transgenders were also they were protectors of women, believe it or not. They would have them as guards. They called them eunuchs. They would have these very muscular men, and they would castrate them, and then they would force them to act as guards to protect basically their betters. They would choose men from among the population who they believed would be good fighters, and then they would remove what, in my opinion, would make them a good fighter. And they would then allow them to have a very esteemed place in society as a protector, as a guard, or as an entertainer. These are the people who would perform the plays and the societal culture implementation of various things of what's popular in Egyptian society by dancing and singing and being performers, placed above all in doing this, except for the dogs, who were worshipped as deities. But the entertainers were even forced to entertain the dogs themselves, because that's how highly they regarded them. And that's what we see today in our society right now. We see dog worshippers. We see these people who have been chemically and physically castrated entertaining us. And it's a society that is the mirror image, almost, not quite, but almost, of Egypt. Because all the work that you do is not in service to you. Because that's why it's taxed, involuntarily taxed. Because that's Egyptian culture. You don't own the money. They own the money, even if you earn the money. And in Egypt, if a slave earned money, a slave would be killed or maimed severely, because that's not allowed. Everything with Egyptian culture was ultimately in service to the transhumanism agenda. It was almost as if a complete crossbreeding of man and beast. They worshipped men who were also half dog or half hawk or half bear. And it's because they believed in human chimeras, like a human hybrid of sorts, because they believe that man is deeply flawed, which is why in that society, bestiality was rampant. A lot of people were not only having sex with the eunuchs, but they were having sexual relations with the dogs themselves, as well as cats and other various creatures that they would find around their civilization. It was widely known that crossbreeding was, in this culture, a path to being with the gods. So it was a path that led you down the transhumanism path, which was supposedly the true path to being a deity yourself. And this was one of the lies that they told the people, that they could do this, they could have sex with all these animals, and it would make them somehow better than what they were. And the people believed this. Everyone except for Israel, which is why Israel was so hated. And when Israel was eventually released by them, they decided that they wanted to still try and kill them. Even though they failed and completely destroyed their armies attempting such madness, it was believed that they had created the greatest civilization ever. And the civilizations that are in existence now are an attempt to replicate Egyptian society, a society of absolute madness, of transhumanism, bestiality, and all manner of wickedness.